The biting chill of dawn clung to the edges of Los Angeles streets, casting long shadows over an uneven sidewalk. A man shuffled slowly past rows of parked cars, his ragged hoodie pulled tight over a face worn by weather and worry. Strands of unkempt hair peeked out, and his hands, cracked and raw, trembled as they gripped a cardboard sign. The words, scrawled in faint marker strokes, read, "Hungry. Anything helps." Beneath a flickering street lamp he paused, his gaze falling on the pedestrians who passed without a glance. The early morning bustle was already in motion. Delivery trucks groaned under the weight of cargo, and bakery scents mingled faintly with the exhaust fumes from idling cars. This corner, wedged between a chain coffee shop and a boarded-up electronics store, had become his domain, a spot where he could observe life rushing past him without ever being swept into its current. To most, he was just another figure blending into the urban sprawl, a detail in the city's chaotic tableau. But to him, each passerby was a potential moment of connection, however fleeting, however unlikely. He adjusted his position on the cold pavement, the cardboard beneath him doing little to shield against the bite of the concrete. The sun's first rays stretched lazily across the horizon, illuminating his surroundings. Wrappers and discarded paper cups littered the sidewalk, remnants of hurried mornings and careless hands. A gust of wind sent a scrap of newspaper fluttering past him, catching briefly on his leg before spiraling away. The man's thoughts drifted, unbidden to the life he'd once lived. A life with structure, purpose, and the faint hum of stability that now felt foreign. Back then, he'd worn pressed shirts and polished shoes. He had a name people remembered. Now the name didn't matter. People didn't stop to ask. He shook his head, as though dispelling a memory too heavy to bear, and pulled his hoodie tighter. Somewhere nearby, the faint jingle of a bicycle bell echoed, followed by the distant bark of a dog. He closed his eyes, momentarily imagining himself somewhere else, anywhere but here. His stomach growled, the gnawing hunger a constant companion that dulled and sharpened in cruel rhythm. The man shifted his gaze back to the street, scanning faces for a flicker of kindness or recognition. Nothing. Just hurried footsteps and downward glances. The city was waking up, but for him, the day felt the same as the one before, and the one before that. Another day invisible, another day surviving. The man's name was Samuel, though he hadn't heard it spoken with care in years. To those who glanced his way, he was simply a drifter, a shadow on the periphery of their vision, barely worth a second look. He sat slumped on the corner of 5th and Main, his makeshift shelter cobbled together with discarded cardboard boxes and a tattered blanket that offered little protection from the biting wind. His eyes, once filled with determination, now carried a dull sheen of resignation, reflecting a life that seemed to ebb further from his grasp with every passing day. The city around him was a cacophony of life and sound. Cars honked impatiently as commuters jostled for position on the road. A vendor down the street shouted about fresh tamales, his voice cutting through the din like a knife. Bright neon signs flickered above storefronts, promising everything from quick loans to hot coffee. Yet none of it touched Samuel's world. His existence had shrunk to this corner, this stretch of pavement where he'd become a fixture. It hadn't always been this way. Samuel had once walked these same streets with purpose, a briefcase in hand and dreams brimming in his heart. He had worked in finance, building a modest but steady career. The pressure had been immense, the hours punishing, but he had thrived. Or so he thought. A single misstep, a poorly calculated investment, and his life had unraveled. Fired, blacklisted, and buried under a mountain of debt, Samuel's descent into homelessness had been slow but inexorable. He had tried to climb back up, taking odd jobs where he could find them, but the stigma of failure clung to him like a shroud, leaving him stranded. Now he existed in the in-between, surviving on the kindness of strangers, though kindness was in short supply. The coins that clinked into his tin cup were more out of obligation than compassion. Most people avoided his eyes altogether, afraid to confront the reality of what could happen if their own luck ran out. The cold gnawed at his bones as he adjusted his position on the hard ground. Across the street, a man in a suit hurriedly stepped into a gleaming black sedan. Samuel watched as the car pulled away, the envy rising unbidden in his chest. It wasn't just the money or the comfort he missed, it was the sense of being someone, of mattering. For Samuel, the city's vibrancy was a cruel reminder of what he had lost. It started as just another morning, the kind Samuel had come to expect. The sun had risen, painting the sky with soft hues of orange and pink, though its warmth did little to dispel the chill in the air. Samuel was perched on his usual spot, clutching his tin cup, his sign resting against his knees. Pedestrians bustled past him with the same hurried indifference, their eyes fixed on distant goals that didn't include him. Then something unusual happened. A sleek, metallic gray Tesla rolled to a stop across the street. The car stood out, even in a city accustomed to displays of wealth. Its sharp lines gleamed under the rising sun, and the silent hum of its engine seemed to underscore its presence. Samuel barely registered it at first. Luxury vehicles were common in this part of town, but when the driver's side door opened, his attention shifted. Out stepped a man dressed plainly, almost too plainly for the car he emerged from. He wore a simple hooded sweatshirt and jeans, his head slightly bowed as if trying to go unnoticed. The man's movements were purposeful yet unhurried as he walked towards Samuel's corner. At first, Samuel thought he was just another passerby, maybe someone headed to the coffee shop nearby. But then the man stopped directly in front of him. Samuel glanced up, surprised. The man's face was familiar in a way that made his stomach churn with unease. He had seen it before, perhaps on a billboard or a magazine cover. The sharp jawline, the piercing gaze that seemed to both see everything and keep secrets. It took him a moment to place it. Elon Musk. The realization hit Samuel like a wave, but he quickly buried it, unsure if his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. Why would someone like Elon Musk be standing here, looking at him? It didn't make sense. He straightened slightly, clutching his cup tighter. "Can I help you?" Samuel muttered, his voice rough from disuse. The man didn't reply right away. Instead, he crouched to Samuel's level, his face softening. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone devoid of judgment or pity. Samuel hesitated, torn between curiosity and wariness. "Samuel," he said finally. The man nodded, as if committing the name to memory. "I'm here to learn," he said simply, and with that cryptic statement, he sat down on the cold pavement beside Samuel, ignoring the curious stares of those walking past. Samuel stared at the man sitting beside him, the disbelief etched across his face mingling with a growing unease. Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur, was here, on this grimy corner, speaking to him as if they were equals. It felt surreal, almost like a cruel joke. People like Musk didn't step into lives like his. Samuel shifted uncomfortably, his instincts telling him to guard his dignity against whatever this encounter might bring. "What do you mean you're here to learn?" Samuel asked, his voice cautious, each word measured. Elon glanced at the bustling street before turning his gaze back to Samuel. "I've always wondered what it's like, being unseen," he said quietly. "I wanted to understand, really understand, what people go through when the world stops looking at them." Samuel's initial wariness was joined by a flicker of resentment. Understanding. What could someone like this man possibly know about his reality? The thought hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. Samuel forced himself to respond. "You think sitting here for a couple of hours will help you understand?" His voice was sharper now, the bitterness he usually suppressed rising to the surface. "You'll go back to your mansion. I'm stuck here." The words hung between them, raw and unfiltered. Elon didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded, as if expecting Samuel's skepticism. "I'm not pretending I can live your life. I know I'll never really know what this feels like. But I want to try. Even a glimpse might help me see what I've been missing." Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. The man's words were sincere, but sincerity didn't change the weight of Samuel's circumstances. Yet, as much as he wanted to brush him off, there was something disarming about Musk's presence. His willingness to sit on the cold pavement, his refusal to look away. It wasn't pity in his eyes, nor was it the detached curiosity Samuel had grown used to. It was something different, something genuine. The external obstacles in Samuel's world loomed large as ever. The hunger gnawed at him relentlessly, his joints ached from nights on the hard ground, and the cold was a constant thief of warmth. His internal battle, though, was just as fierce. Trust was a scarce commodity. The sting of rejection, of being reduced to a mere shadow in the world's periphery, had left wounds that ran deep. "Why me?" Samuel asked finally, his voice quieter now. Elon leaned back slightly, crossing his arms as if considering the question. "I don't know. Maybe because you're here, and I'm here." He paused, his gaze steady. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to spend the day with you. No strings, no cameras. Just to see." Samuel hesitated. Part of him wanted to tell Elon to leave, to go back to whatever insulated world he'd come from. But another part, buried beneath the layers of cynicism, whispered that maybe this could be different. Maybe, for once, someone truly wanted to listen. "Fine," Samuel said, his voice tight. "But don't expect a neat little story to take home." A faint smile touched Elon's lips. "I wouldn't dream of it." And so, as the morning traffic ebbed and flowed, Samuel found himself facing a challenge he hadn't expected. Not just surviving another day on the streets, but allowing someone to step into his world and bear witness to its weight. The morning unfolded with a strange rhythm, as Elon and Samuel settled into an uneasy partnership. For Samuel, the act of allowing someone, anyone, to observe his day was fraught with vulnerability. His life was not something he displayed willingly, it was a daily grind of small humiliations, unspoken fears, and an aching loneliness he kept buried beneath a hardened exterior. Yet, as Elon shadowed him, Samuel couldn't shake the curiosity about what this man, with his billions and boundless opportunities, hoped to gain. Their first stop was the public park, where Samuel often searched for discarded items he could repurpose. The ground was littered with remnants of lives more fortunate, half-empty water bottles, torn clothing, and forgotten toys. Elon followed closely, his eyes scanning the scene with an intensity that made Samuel uncomfortable. "You don't have to do this, Samuel muttered, crouching to inspect a battered backpack. "You can go home any time." "I know," Elon replied simply, his voice calm. He didn't elaborate, and Samuel didn't push. The day continued with its small routines. Samuel showed Elon the corner where he could sometimes count on a warm bowl of soup from a church charity. The line was long, as always, filled with faces etched with the same weariness Samuel knew all too well. Elon stood silently beside him, his hoodie pulled low over his face, blending in with the crowd. When it was finally their turn, Samuel accepted the meal with a quiet thank you. Elon took his portion and handed it to a woman at the back of the line, her wide eyes betraying both gratitude and disbelief. As the hours passed, Samuel began to notice a shift. At first, he'd been hyper-aware of Elon's presence, his every move tinged with self-consciousness. But Elon wasn't asking intrusive questions or offering unsolicited advice. Instead, he listened, truly listened. When Samuel spoke about the challenges of navigating shelters, Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. When Samuel described the sting of being ignored, Elon's gaze grew distant, as if he were turning the words over in his mind. Samuel said after a long silence, "It's not just about the money. It's the way people look at you or don't. Like you don't exist. That's the hardest part." Elon glanced at him, his expression somber. "I can see that," he said softly. "And it's not right." For the first time in years, Samuel felt seen. Not in the fleeting, surface-level way that passersby sometimes threw a glance his way, but in a deeper, almost unsettling way, as though Elon wasn't just observing his life, but trying to feel its weight. By the time dusk settled over the city, they found themselves back on Samuel's corner. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows. Samuel leaned back against the wall, his exhaustion palpable. Elon sat beside him, their silence comfortable now, almost companionable. "You've had a long day," Samuel said, his voice laced with dry humor. "This what you expected?" Elon smiled faintly. "It's not about expectations. It's about understanding." Samuel scoffed, though there was no malice in it. "Understanding, huh? And what do you understand now? Elon hesitated, his gaze fixed on the traffic flowing past them. That I've spent a lot of time building things for the future, but there are people who can't think about tomorrow because today is so heavy. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Samuel didn't know how to respond. He hadn't expected anything profound to come from this strange encounter, but Elon's quiet acknowledgement stirred something in him, a flicker of hope, fragile but undeniable. The city's heartbeat slowed as night blanketed the streets. Samuel and Elon sat in silence, their breaths visible in the crisp evening air. A few feet away, the remnants of Samuel's cardboard shelter leaned against the wall, its frailty a stark metaphor for his life. Samuel pulled his tattered hoodie tighter, glancing at Elon. "You're really not leaving, are you?" Elon shook his head, his gaze steady. "Not yet." Samuel sighed, his skepticism still intact. "I don't know what you're hoping to prove." "It's not about proving anything," Elon replied, his voice quiet. "It's about seeing the things I've ignored." Samuel let the words settle, unsure of what to make of them. The silence stretched between them until it was broken by the sudden, sharp sound of shouting down the street. Both men turned to see a commotion unfolding near a convenience store. A disheveled young man, barely out of his teens, was being dragged out by the store owner, his thin arms flailing in protest. "Caught him stealing again," the owner barked, holding a crumpled bag of chips in one hand. "Get out of here." The young man stumbled onto the sidewalk, his face flushed with humiliation. He glanced around, his wide eyes filled with fear and desperation. Samuel recognized that look. It was the same one he'd worn the first time he'd realized how far he'd fallen. Without thinking, Samuel stood. "Wait," he called out, stepping toward the scene. Elon followed, his expression unreadable. "Hey man, don't get involved," the store owner warned, his tone harsh. "This kid's a thief." Samuel held up his hands, his voice calm but firm. "He's just hungry. Let him go." The store owner hesitated, his anger faltering under Samuel's steady gaze. "Fine," he muttered, tossing the chips toward the young man. "But don't let me catch you here again." The boy scrambled to his feet, clutching the bag to his chest. He looked at Samuel, his lips trembling. "Thank you," he whispered before disappearing into the shadows. Samuel turned back to Elon, who was watching him with an expression that was impossible to decipher. "Why'd you do that?" Elon asked, his voice low. Samuel shrugged, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "Because I know what it feels like to have nothing. And no one." Elon nodded, his jaw tightening. "That," he said, "is why I'm here." The moment crystallized something for both of them. For Samuel, it was a reminder that even in the depths of despair, small acts of kindness could ripple outward. For Elon, it was a realization that the systems he built, the wealth, the technology, the innovations, had often overlooked the people they were meant to help. As they returned to their spot on the corner, Samuel felt something shift. It wasn't just the gratitude of the young man he helped or the surprising camaraderie he'd found with Elon. It was the sense that, perhaps, his story wasn't finished yet. The following morning arrived with muted light filtering through the gray sky. The chill lingered, but there was a subtle warmth in the air that Samuel couldn't quite place. He awoke to the sound of footsteps. Elon was already up, standing near the curb, staring out at the city as though he were seeing it anew. Samuel stretched, his joints stiff from another night on the pavement. "You're still here," Samuel said, his voice hoarse but carrying a hint of surprise. Elon turned, a faint smile on his face. "I told you I wasn't leaving." Samuel shook his head, the disbelief still etched into his features. "So what now? You've walked a day in my shoes, seen how I survive. Is this where you go back to your world?" Elon stepped closer, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. "Not yet," he said. "I came here to understand, but now I realize I can't just walk away, not without doing something." Samuel's brow furrowed. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "It means I can't fix everything," Elon admitted, his tone matter of fact. "But I can start with something. With you." Samuel stiffened, instinctively retreating into the defenses he'd spent years building. I don't need your charity, he said sharply. I've been fine on my own. Fine. Elon asked, his voice gentle but firm. You're surviving, Samuel. Barely. That's not the same as living. The words stung because they were true. Samuel opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. He stared at Elon, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to articulate. I'm not talking about handouts, Elon continued. I'm talking about opportunity. You said yesterday that it's not just about the money, it's about being seen, being part of something. Let me help you find that again. Samuel's defenses wavered. The raw honesty in Elon's words made it hard to dismiss him. Why me? Samuel asked finally, his voice quieter now. Because you deserve a chance, Elon replied simply, and because I can. The rest of the day unfolded with a sense of purpose Samuel hadn't felt in years. Elon made calls, his quiet determination cutting through layers of bureaucracy that Samuel had spent years being crushed by. By nightfall, Samuel had a place in a temporary shelter, an appointment to meet with a job counselor, and a promise from Elon to fund his next steps. As they parted ways, Samuel felt an unfamiliar sensation blew in his chest. It wasn't the immediate relief of hunger satisfied or warmth regained. It was hope. Hope that maybe this time things could be different. Weeks passed, and Samuel's life began to shift in ways he hadn't imagined. The shelter wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and safe, offering him a bed and a chance to rest without the constant fear of the streets. The job counselor, who had seemed skeptical at first, quickly realized Samuel's sharp mind and determination. Slowly, opportunities began to emerge, not grandiose, but enough to provide a foothold. Elon stayed true to his word, checking in periodically without fanfare or spectacle. His involvement wasn't intrusive. He didn't hover or dictate. Instead, he offered quiet support, leveraging his resources to open doors Samuel couldn't have pushed through alone. It wasn't charity, Samuel realized. It was a bridge back to the person he used to be. One afternoon, as Samuel stood behind the counter of a small electronics repair shop, a job he'd secured through his counselor, he paused to take in his surroundings. The hum of machinery, the scent of soldering irons, the faint murmur of customers discussing their broken devices, it all felt surreal. For the first time in years, he felt grounded, useful, seen. It wasn't easy. The scars of his years on the streets didn't vanish overnight. There were moments when the fear of slipping back gripped him like a vice, when the enormity of rebuilding his life seemed too much to bear. But every time doubt threatened to overwhelm him, he thought back to that strange day when a man stepped out of a Tesla and sat beside him on the pavement. A man who listened without judgment, who didn't treat him as a project, but as a person. One evening, after locking up the shop, Samuel found himself walking past the corner where it had all started. The memories flooded back, the cold, the hunger, the unyielding sense of invisibility. But this time, they didn't crush him. Instead, they reminded him of how far he'd come. Across the street, he spotted Elon standing by a bench, his hands in his pockets, watching the city's bustle with that same quiet intensity Samuel had come to recognize. Without hesitation, Samuel crossed the road. "You checking up on me?" Samuel asked, his tone light but carrying an undercurrent of gratitude. Elon turned, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not checking. Just wondering how you're doing." Samuel nodded, the weight of his journey reflected in his steady gaze. "Better. A lot better." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city swirling around them. Finally, Samuel broke the quiet. "You know, I used to think no one cared. That people like me didn't matter." "You do," Elon said simply. "Everyone does. We just forget to see it." As Samuel walked away that night, he carried those words with him. They didn't erase the struggles he'd endured, but they gave him something he hadn't felt in years, a belief that he could not only survive but thrive. And while his path forward wasn't guaranteed, Samuel knew one thing for certain: he wasn't invisible anymore.